4 empires across 5 centuries followed the exact same collapse sequence. Decision by decision, mistake by mistake. Almost like reading from a script written in Rome 2,000 years ago. Spain controlled half the world's silver, bankrupt in 80 years. Britain ruled 25% of Earth's land, empire gone in 40 years. The Soviet Union had 15,000 nuclear weapons, dissolved in 900 days. 3 times. 3 superpowers. 3 complete collapses, all following the exact same pattern. The United States is already past the halfway point. We're not approaching the collapse sequence. We're deep inside it. This is the story of how empires die, why they always think they're different, and why the math says we're next. Before we go through the pattern, you need to understand what imperial collapse actually looks like. Not in textbooks. In practice. Imperial collapse doesn't start with invasion or military defeat. It starts with economic exhaustion. The empire extends beyond its ability to maintain itself. Military bases in 150 countries. Wars on multiple fronts. Promises it cannot keep. Debts it cannot repay. At first, the decline is invisible. The currency still works. The military still wins battles. The government still makes promises. But beneath the surface, the foundation is cracking. Then comes the acceleration. Allies start hedging. Enemies test boundaries. Trade partners seek alternatives. The reserve currency status erodes. And suddenly, the advantages that made you powerful become vulnerabilities. Your currency, once demanded by everyone, comes flooding back home. Your military spread across the world becomes unsustainable. Your promises, once guaranteed by strength, become empty words. That's not theoretical. That's what happened to Rome, Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union. It happened because they made exactly the same decisions we're making now. They believed their power was permanent. They overextended militarily. They debased their currency, and they refused to accept reality until collapse was already underway. The pattern moves through 7 phases. It begins with military overextension. Then comes currency debasement. That triggers a debt spiral. The debt spiral destroys productive capacity. Productive collapse leads to social decay. Social decay erodes legitimacy. And when legitimacy dies, the empire follows. Every empire in history has followed this sequence. Not approximately, exactly. Let me show you how it happened 4 times, and why we're watching it happen a 5th time right now. Rome wasn't conquered. Rome rotted from within. At its peak in the 2nd century, the Roman Empire controlled the entire Mediterranean, most of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. 5 million square kilometers, 60 million people. The most powerful military force the world had ever seen. They had a currency called the dinar. When it was introduced in 211 BC, it was 4.5 grams of pure silver. It was the reserve currency of the ancient world. Merchants from Britain to Persia accepted it because they trusted it. That trust was Rome's greatest asset. The cracks appeared first in the military. Rome started fighting wars it couldn't afford. By the 1st century, the legions were stationed from Scotland to Syria. Maintaining those borders required constant military spending. The soldiers demanded payment. The generals demanded resources. The wars never ended because the empire never stopped expanding. Every new territory meant new borders to defend. Every new border meant more soldiers. Every new soldier meant more money. But the silver mines weren't producing fast enough to keep up. The solution they chose destroyed them. In 64 AD, Emperor Nero faced a crisis. The treasury was empty. The Great Fire of Rome had destroyed 2/3 of the city. Rebuilding would cost a fortune. The wars continued, so Nero did what every desperate government does. He debased the currency. He reduced the silver content of the denarius by 20%. Same coin, same face value, less actual silver. More coins could be minted from the same amount of metal. Problem solved. Except it wasn't solved. It was the beginning of the end. Nero's debasement set a precedent that every emperor after him followed. When you need more money, just reduce the silver content. Make more coins. Pay the soldiers' fund. Wars. Keep the empire running. By 100 AD, the denarius had lost 15% of its silver. By 200 AD, it had lost 50%. By 270 AD, it contained less than 5% silver. By the time the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, the denarius contained 0.02% silver. It wasn't money anymore. It was worthless, metal with a stamp on it. Debt spiral followed inevitably. As the currency lost value, prices exploded. Merchants who once accepted denarii started demanding more of them. Then they started demanding payment in gold. Then they started refusing Roman currency altogether. The government needed more money to pay soldiers whose salaries bought less and less each year. So they minted more worthless coins, which drove prices higher, which required more coins. The spiral had no exit. Beneath the financial chaos, something more fundamental was breaking. Rome never built a real economy. The empire ran on conquest. Conquer new territory. Steal their gold. Enslave their population. Use that wealth to fund more conquests. When expansion stopped, the money stopped. Rome didn't manufacture goods for export. Rome didn't innovate. Rome consumed what others produced. When the flow of conquest wealth ended, there was nothing underneath. The economy was hollow. The social fabric tore next. Tax collection became impossible because the taxes were paid in worthless currency. The wealthy fled to rural estates and stopped participating in civic life. The middle class disappeared. The poor had nothing left to lose. Regional commanders started acting independently because the central government couldn't pay them. Loyalty evaporated when the money did. By the 4th and 5th centuries, being Roman emperor was one of the most dangerous jobs on earth. Emperors were assassinated constantly. 20 emperors in 50 years. During the crisis of the 3rd century, the government couldn't protect its citizens. It couldn't maintain order. It couldn't deliver on any promise. The idea of Rome had died long before the actual empire fell. The legitimacy was gone. People stopped believing. The final collapse was just a formality. In 476 AD, the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a teenager named Romulus. There was no great battle, no dramatic last stand. The empire had been dead for decades. Odoacer just buried it. The Roman Empire didn't fall in a day. It fell in 400 years. But the decisions that guaranteed its collapse were made in the 1st century. Once Nero debased the currency, the math was set. Everything after was just the pattern playing out. 1100 years later, Spain repeated every single mistake. By 1550, Spain was the most powerful empire on earth. They had conquered the Aztecs and the Incas. They controlled most of South America, Central America, the Caribbean, and significant portions of North America. They ruled the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and territories across Europe. And they had something no empire in history had ever possessed: unlimited silver. Potosin, in what is now Bolivia, was the largest silver deposit ever discovered. At its peak, this single mountain produced half of all the silver in the world. Spanish galleons carried tons of silver across the Atlantic every year. The Spanish real became the first global reserve currency. Merchants from Beijing to Boston accepted it. Spain had won. They had infinite money, infinite power. What could possibly go wrong? The overreach came quickly. Between 1568 and 1648, Spain fought continuously in the Netherlands, France, England, the Mediterranean, and the Americas. 80 years of warfare across 5 fronts simultaneously. The cost was catastrophic. Military spending consumed 75% of state revenue. They weren't building infrastructure. They weren't investing in industry. They were burning silver in endless wars against enemies who kept multiplying. Even infinite silver wasn't enough. Spain didn't just spend their silver. They spent their future silver. They borrowed against shipments that hadn't left Peru yet. When those loans came due and the silver wasn't enough, they debated. In 1599, Spanish coins were 93% silver. By 1650, they were 30% silver and 70% copper. The same face value, 1/3. The actual worth, but Spain had a bigger problem. The silver mines of Potosi were 8,000 miles from Madrid. The mint officials in Potosi realized they could skim. They reduced the silver content of coins before they even left South America. By the 1630s, when merchants in Europe melted down Spanish coins, they discovered 20 to 30% less silver than there should have been. Word spread. Merchants from Boston to Beijing started rejecting Potosi coins. Spanish soldiers refused to accept their own salary. The currency that controlled world trade became worthless in a single generation. The borrowing turned predatory. By 1640, Spain owed money to every bank in Europe. They borrowed from Genoese bankers at 40% interest to pay German bankers at 30% interest. They weren't borrowing to invest. They were borrowing to service previous debt. The interest alone exceeded their income. Spain defaulted in 1557, 1575, 1596, 1607, 1627, 1647, and 1687 times in 123 years. Each default destroyed their credibility. Each default made the next loan more expensive. Each loan made the next default more certain. Here's what nobody talks about. Spain never produced anything. They were a conduit, not a creator. Silver came from Peru, flowed through Spain, and went straight to the Netherlands, England, and France to buy manufactured goods. While Spain was fighting wars, the Dutch were building ships. While Spain was mining silver, England was developing industry. While Spain was importing everything, France was exporting everything. When the silver ran out, Spain had nothing. They couldn't make their own weapons. They couldn't build their own ships. They couldn't produce their own cloth. They had the wealth, but not the capacity. And wealth without capacity is just a temporary condition. The empire began tearing itself apart. Spanish nobles stopped paying taxes. They claimed exemptions. The middle class was crushed between inflation and taxation. They disappeared. The poor revolted. Catalonia rebelled in 1640. Portugal declared independence in 1640. Naples erupted in 1647. The center could untold because the center had nothing to offer. No economic opportunity, no stable currency, no functioning government, just endless demands for taxes to fund endless wars that produced endless losses. The rot at the top became undeniable. Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, was so inbred that he couldn't chew his own food. His jaw was so deformed from generations of royal intermarriage that he could barely speak. He was mentally disabled, physically frail, and completely incapable of ruling. He was the perfect symbol of what Spain had become, a once great power reduced to a genetic dead end. He died in 1700 without an heir, triggering a European war over who would control what remained. The dissolution played out across 2 centuries. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 stripped Spain of its European territories. The Netherlands were gone. Italy was gone. The monopoly on Atlantic trade was gone. Throughout the 1800s, the American colonies declared independence, one by one: Mexico, Peruan, Argentina, Chile, Colombia. By 1898, Spain lost its last significant colonies, Cuba and the Philippines, to the United States. The empire that controlled half the world's wealth was erased from the map, not by a foreign conqueror, by its own decisions. By the same pattern that killed Rome, Britain should have learned from Spain. They didn't. By 1900, the British Empire was the largest in human history. 25% of Earth's land surface, 400 million people. 1/4 of the human race lived under British rule. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. The Royal Navy controlled every ocean. British manufactured goods dominated global trade. London was the financial capital of the world. This was the empire where the sun never set. The strain of global dominance started earlier than most people realize. Maintaining worldwide supremacy is expensive. By the late 1800s, Britain was spending enormous sums, defending territories on every continent. India required a massive military presence. Africa required constant intervention. The rivalry with Germany demanded an ever larger navy. Then came World War I. In 1914, British national debt was £650 million, about 30% of GDP. By 1919, it was £7.7 billion. The debt to GDP ratio exploded to over 130%. Britain borrowed to survive. They borrowed from their own citizens. They borrowed from the United States. They mortgaged their future to win a war that killed nearly 1 million British soldiers. The currency manipulation was more subtle than Rome or Spain. Britain didn't debase the pound with copper. They inflated it with debt, but the effect was the same. In 1914, the pound was backed by gold. You could exchange paper currency for physical gold at a fixed rate. After the war, that became impossible. There wasn't enough gold. So Britain suspended gold convertibility, printed money to pay debts, then tried to return to the gold standard at the pre-war rate in 1925. It was a disaster. The currency was overvalued. Exports collapsed. Unemployment soared. The British economy never recovered. By 1945, Britain was technically victorious, but economically destroyed. They owed billions. Their industrial base was damaged. Their empire was restless. The industrial advantage had already slipped away. While Britain built an empire, other nations built industries. Germany developed superior manufacturing. The United States achieved economies of scale that Britain couldn't match. Japan modernized and began competing in Asian markets. Britain's early industrial lead became a liability. Their factories were old. Their methods were outdated. They had been coasting on empire rather than innovating at home. Colonial revolt followed economic weakness. India demanded independence. Gandhi's movement made British rule untenable. In 1947, the British Raj ended. 400 years of British presence in India concluded in a single year. The partition killed 1 million people and displaced 15 million more. Britain couldn't maintain order. They could only leave. After India, the dominoes fell. Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963. One by one, African and Asian colonies declared independence. The empire didn't collapse in war. It collapsed because Britain couldn't afford it anymore and couldn't justify it morally. The Suez Crisis of 1956 exposed everything. Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain, along with France and Israel, invaded to take it back. The United States, now the dominant Western power, demanded they withdraw. Britain complied. The humiliation was total. The former master of the world was taking orders from its former colony. Everyone saw it. Everyone understood. Britain was no longer a great power. It was a medium-sized island nation, pretending to be something more. The final chapter closed in 1997 when Britain handed Hong Kong to China. The ceremony was broadcast worldwide. The Union Jack came down. The Chinese flag went up. One newspaper described it as the moment Britain shut down the empire that once encompassed 1/4 of the globe. From the height of power to a small island in the North Atlantic. 3 generations. The same pattern. The same result. The Soviet Union collapsed so fast that people still don't fully understand what happened. In 1985, the USSR was a military superpower. 15,000 nuclear weapons. The largest army in Europe. Control over Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and significant influence across the developing world. 40 years of Cold War had proven that the Soviet system could compete with the West. Then it vanished. The military burden was hidden behind ideology. The Soviet Union spent somewhere between 15 and 25% of its entire GDP on the military. Some estimates put it at 1/3. The exact numbers were secret even from Soviet officials. But the effect was visible. Consumer goods were scarce. Infrastructure, agriculture couldn't feed the population. Every ruble spent on missiles was a ruble not spent on making life bearable for Soviet citizens. The Afghan War broke the illusion. From 1979 to 1989, the Soviet Union fought a guerrilla war in Afghanistan that consumed resources, killed soldiers, and achieved nothing. It was their Vietnam. The defeat was humiliating. The cost was unsustainable. And unlike the Americans in Vietnam, the Soviets couldn't afford the loss. The economic deception was different, but mathematically identical. The Soviets didn't debase a currency. They maintained an artificial economy that produced fictitious value. The ruble wasn't traded on international markets. Prices were set by government decree. Production quotas were met on paper, while factories produced nothing useful. The entire economy was a fiction. When that fiction cracked, there was nothing underneath. The hidden debt couldn't be acknowledged. By the time the Soviet Union dissolved, it owed $66 billion to foreign creditors, but the real debt was internal. Decades of inefficiency, decades of pretending that the system worked when everyone knew it didn't. The Soviet Union didn't have a debt crisis, it had a reality crisis. The productive failure was catastrophic. The Soviet Union was supposed to be an industrial superpower. In practice, it couldn't produce consumer goods that anyone wanted to buy. Their cars were jokes, their electronics were decades behind. Their agriculture required imports from the capitalist countries they were supposed to bury. When the oil price collapsed in the 1980s and Soviet energy revenues plummeted, there was nothing else. The economy had no foundation. The unraveling happened with shocking speed. Between 1989 and 1991, every satellite state broke away. East, Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary and Romania, Bulgaria. The governments that had been propped up by Soviet tanks discovered that the tanks weren't coming. People took to the streets. Walls came down. Regimes fell, and Moscow did nothing, because Moscow couldn't do anything. They couldn't afford intervention. They couldn't afford suppression. They could only watch. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms exposed the hollow. He tried to reform a system that couldn't be reformed. Glasnost opened discussion. Perestroika opened Marcus. Both exposed how hollow the Soviet Union had become. Once people could speak freely, they asked why they should remain. Once the Baltic states demanded independence, the logic of union collapsed. If Lithuania could leave, why not Ukraine? If Ukraine could leave, why not Russia itself? The end took exactly 900 days. From the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991. 25 years of Cold War standoff ended not with nuclear fire but with a bureaucratic vote. The Soviet flag came down. 15 new nations emerged. An empire with 15,000 nuclear weapons simply ceased to exist. No invasion. The system consumed itself. The same pattern, compressed into a decade. The fastest imperial collapse in history. Now let's talk about where we are. The United States is already past the halfway point. We're not approaching the pattern. We're inside it. Let me show you exactly where. The military footprint stretches beyond anything in history. The United States maintains approximately 750 military bases in at least 80 countries. The defense budget exceeds $800 billion per year, more than the next 10 countries combined. Since 2001, the United States has been continuously at war somewhere on Earth. Afghanistan for 20 years, Iraq for 2 decades, on and off, Syrian, Libyan, Yemen, Somalia. Drone strikes in countries most Americans can't find on a map. The cost of the post-9/11 wars exceeds $8 trillion, according to Brown University's Costs of War project. Rome spread itself across Europe. Spain spread itself across 5 continents. Britain spread itself across a quarter of the globe. The United States spread itself across the entire world. The pattern is the same. The scale is larger. The currency manipulation is more elegant, but equally destructive. The United States doesn't mix copper into silver coins. It creates money from nothing. In 2020 alone, the Federal Reserve created over $3 trillion to respond to the pandemic. The money supply increased by 40% in 2 years. The purchasing power of the dollar has declined by over 9% since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. $1 in 1913 bought what $26 buys today? That's not inflation. That's slow motion debasement. The mechanism is different. The math is identical. The debt has reached escape velocity. The U.S. national debt exceeded $34 trillion in 2024. That's 123% of GDP. For comparison, Spain's D2 GDP ratio when they collapsed was lower. In 2024, the United States spent over $1 trillion just on interest payments. That's more than the entire defense budget. That's more than Medicare. The government is borrowing money to pay interest on money it already borrowed. The spiral has no exit. You can't grow fast enough to escape compound interest at this scale. You can't cut spending because you've made promises you can't break. You can't raise taxes enough because the economy would collapse. There is no mathematical solution. Only delay. The productive capacity has hollowed out. In 1960, manufacturing was 27% of U.S. GDP. Today, it's under 11%. America doesn't make things anymore. It imports them. The trade deficit in 2023 was $773 billion. The United States sends dollars overseas and receives goods in return. When those dollars come home, when foreign nations decide they'd rather have something other than American paper, the system reverses. Spain was a conduit for silver. America is a conduit for debt. The social fractures are deepening by the year. This is what America is right now. Life expectancy in the United States peaked in 2014 at 78.8 years. It then declined, falling to 76.1 years by 2022, the lowest since 1996. It's recovered slightly since then, but remains below comparable developed nations. Americans die younger than people in every other wealthy country. Trust in government is at historic lows. Only 22% of Americans say they trust the federal government to do what is right. The political system is so polarized that basic governance has become impossible. Infrastructure crumbles. The middle class shrinks. Deaths of despair from drugs, alcohol, and suicide have created a mortality crisis, unlike anything seen in the developed world. The symptoms are identical to Rome in the 4th century, Spain in the 17th, Britain in the 20th, and the Soviet Union in its final years. The center is not holding. The legitimacy is beginning to crack. This hasn't fully happened yet, but the warning signs are everywhere. When half the country doesn't believe elections are legitimate, when institutions are trusted by only one party at a time, when the basic facts of reality are contested along political lines, legitimacy is fracturing. Rome's emperors were assassinated because no one believed in the system anymore. Soviet citizens stopped believing, and the empire vanished in 900 days. Legitimacy is not a policy question. It's a faith question. And faith, once lost, cannot be restored by legislation. The final phase hasn't happened. Yet, the United States still has time. The pattern shows what happens when empires refuse to adapt. Rome could have stopped debasing its currency. Spain could have invested in production instead of conquest. Britain could have decolonized gracefully instead of being forced out. The Soviet Union could have reformed before it was too late. They didn't. They all believed they were different. They all believed their power was permanent. They all believed the rules didn't apply to them. The math is not destiny. It's a warning. The 7 phases are not inevitable. They're the result of choices. Specific decisions made by specific people who could unsee past their immediate circumstances to the consequences decades away. The choice to fund wars with borrowed money. The choice to debase currency rather than face difficult truths. The choice to consume rather than produce. The choice to divide rather than unite. Each choice seems rational in the moment. Each choice makes the next phase more likely. Each phase makes recovery harder, until one day, the accumulated choices become irreversible, and the pattern completes itself. Rome took 400 years to fall. Spain took 200. Britain took 80. The Soviet Union took 10. The pattern is accelerating. Information moves faster. Capital moves faster. Consequences arrive faster. Whatever happens to the United States will happen faster than anything before it. This isn't pessimism. This is pattern recognition. The same sequence, repeated across 2,000 years, is now playing out in real time. The question isn't whether the pattern exists. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is whether the United States will be the first empire to break it, or the 5th to complete it. Empires don't collapse because they're attacked from outside. They collapse because they hollow themselves out from within. They spend what they don't have. They promise what they can't deliver. They debase their currency and wonder why prices rise. They spread their military across the world and wonder why they can't defend anything. They divide into factions and wonder why they can't unite. They lose the trust of their citizens and wonder why the system stops working. The pattern isn't a mystery. It's documented history. Rome, Spain, Britain, the Soviet Union. 4 empires, 4 collapses, the same sequence. Every single time. The United States is now inside that pattern. The only question is what comes next.